Shalom. This is the 10th lecture of our history series. It's entitled The 17th Century, and I entitled The Explosion of Jewish Genius, a very incredible century. I want to start with a couple of very important general comments about this period of time. First of all, where are Jews? We talked last time about the Jews until the 10th century. They were in the East, then they moved to Europe. Then in the 15th century, they started to move towards the West. Towards the East, towards Turkey and to Poland. And we ended up last week with that element. Now we're going to start a movement really throughout the world. In Amsterdam and Hamburg, Naples and Venice, Saloniki in Greece and Constantinople, Fez in Morocco, Tlemcen, Algiers and Tunis, Cairo and Alexandria, Jerusalem and Safed, Damascus and Smyrna in Turkey, on the coast of the North Sea and on the shores washed by the Mediterranean and Levantine waters, as well as in the new continent of America and the Isles. The Portuguese, Galician, Castilian, and Catalan dialects were heard on the lips of Jewish exiles from the Iberian Peninsula. All over, these Moranos were all over. These wanderers were either openly professing Jews, directly affected by the decrees of expulsions of 1492, or Moranos who had remained behind and whose existence was made unbearable by the Inquisition. However, we're going to see that these Moranos are going to change the world, and the Jewish world is going to be heavily influenced by these enterprising, intelligent, and very, very interesting people. I want to make a second comment, which is about Jewish economy. What happens in this century? Now, you know that during the period of the Middle Ages, the Jews were not able to participate in agriculture. They were not able to participate in the arts and crafts, in guilds, because they were all closed, because it's only open to Christians. But something happened at the beginning of the modern era in the 17th century. The very fact that the Jews were not involved in the trade guilds and corporations, it allowed them, it made it easier for them to engage in the distribution of new goods, such as cotton, silk, manufacturing workshops, and factories. In other words, the very fact that now they were open, all the other people were involved in agriculture or the guilds, the Jews were the population that were able and open to engage in this kind of enterprise. Commerce, a new mercantile class makes its great effort at this time to participate in the economy of the world. In fact, the Jews are really the driving engine of the economy of the Western world. I want to point out one more observation about this era. The Jews never converted to Christianity, and they alone stood out against the attempt of the church and the state to impose a uniformity of belief everywhere. So similar to what happened in the Tower of Babel. This nonconformity that actually allowed the Jews to remain and to survive kept alive also some degree of freedom in the world for everyone. It made people of intelligence realize the possibility that there might be another point of view, and so prevented their own thought from becoming wholly ostracized. The mere existence of Judaism allowed the world to think there was a possibility of another opinion. That's incredible observation. is something that I'd like you to keep in mind. We're now so the Jews, on the one hand, created the driving element of the economy of the Western world on the economic level. And on the other hand, it politically created the possibility of dissension, the possibility that there are other opinions. This is the greatest legacy that the Jewish people gave the world. This is the age of humanism. In the 17th century, we're going to see that there was a tremendous desire for knowledge. And the desire for knowledge extended to also Hebrew and Jewish literature. Then Christians became interested in learning Hebrew, studying Jewish literature. And the Jewish teachers, Jewish scholars, were at hand to help them. There were philosophers in Verona, in Mantua. Mantua, there was a famous philosopher called Joseph Colon, like Columbus. In Padua, another rabbi, one of his disciples was a famous author, Pico della Mirandola. In Germany, we're going to see somebody by the name of Johann Rauchlin, a non-Jew who was interested in Hebrew. And he produced a book on Hebrew grammar and a dictionary. He was actually interested in having the Jews convert to Christianity, but he did not agree to persecute them. One of his teachers of Reuchlin was none other, Obadia Sforno from Bologna, that in Bologna. The Reformation actually used Jewish literature in its fight against Christianity, for which actually the Romans, the Catholics were going to accuse the Jews of. So the Jews, in a sense, were caught between two extremes. On the one hand, the Catholics hated them because they realized that the Reformation had derived a lot of its fight and strength against intellectual fight against Christianity, Catholicism, from the Jewish literature. On the other hand, the Protestants hated the Jews because they did not accept Luther. Typical. So I want to talk about this concept of the Marrano diaspora first and their importance. Today, we're going to be analyzing this very important diaspora that takes place, especially in Holland and eventually in England and in the Americas. As we explained today, the Marrano diaspora were the first what was called modern Jews, and they actually control most of the commerce in Western Europe. Amsterdam is a very important center. After getting its independence from Spain in the year 1579, but several important people, interesting enough, one of the families of the Marranos was the family of Nunez, like the congressman here in America. And one of the most important people here were the philosopher Manasseh ben Israel, Menashe ben Israel, 17th century, 1604 to 1657. A man of great erudition, Portuguese by descent, and he did a great deal of work. He was a rabbi. He created a Hebrew press in Holland and had relations with a lot of intellectuals. He was actually very close to the Queen Christina of Sweden. He wrote a book called The Conciliator in Spanish, in which he resolved the contradictions that were in scriptures. One of the fascinating things about him, and I want to discuss this aspect, Menashe ben Israel analyzed the Jewish colonies or Jewish settlements in the world, and he realized that the redemption was going to come when the Jews would be extended all over the world. In other words, the redemption had to come after all the Jews was scattered all over the world. There was a prophecy from Daniel. In the book of Daniel, it says, when an end had been made of breaking in pieces and scattering the holy people, the redemption will come. This is the way he understood it. When the Jewish people will be all over the world, from one end to the other, the redemption will come. And that's also what it says in the book of Dvarim, B'Yetziat Shamayim. When the people are all from one end of the world to the other, then Hashem will redeem them. Based on this, Menashe ben Israel wrote a book also in Spanish called The Hope of Israel. And he realized that the Israelite community were all over the world. They were in China. And from China, they went, according to him, they had gone to the Americas, because he had heard from one of the people who had been in America that American Indians were claiming that they were coming from the tribe of Reuven. So he saw in that the redemption was near. If there are Jews all in America, and they're in China, and they're all over the world, that's the time when we can actually have the redemption. What do? He actually went to England. Cromwell and England had just now become a republican in a way, a monarchy as only an ornament. And Cromwell saw the usefulness of Jews as merchants. And Menashe ben Israel realizes the possibility of, remember the Jews had been expelled from England in the 13th century, 1290. So had not been in England for 400 years. So now he translates his book, The Hope of Israel, sends it in Latin with an epistle, a letter to the parliament. And as a result of this, he appeals for the readmission of Jews to England, which is finally allowed by Cromwell in the year 1656. So the Jews are now in England. And remember, who are the Jews who come to England? If you look at British history in the 18th century, 19th century, you see that the majority of the Jews are from Amsterdam, from Holland. So you notice, by the way, the migration. The Jews are expelled from Spain. They move somewhere between Italy and somewhere in Europe. When Amsterdam becomes free from the Spanish dominion, interestingly enough, Holland was part of the Spanish Empire. When Amsterdam gains independence, Holland becomes independent from Spain, the Jews immediately, the Marranos, come to there. And from there, they go to England. Also, by the way, in addition to England, now the Jews are in Germany. They go to Hamburg, the three colonies, Altona, Hamburg, and Wandsbek. There are also a Jewish community led especially by Portuguese Marranos. The first communities of Germany were Jews from Sephardic Jews. It's interesting, by the way, that some of the customs of the Germans that in some ways resemble some customs of Sephardim may have its origin in this idea that the original German Jews were Portuguese Marranos. One of the famous people in this time was a physician. By the way, it's interesting, but throughout history, and especially in the 17th century and the 18th century, the most important Jews were always doctors, just like today. The best doctors are the Jewish doctors. They were doctors, and they were sought everywhere. So the physician Rodrigo de Castro comes to Holland, and there in Amsterdam, he creates around them a very important community. Synagogues begin to be, to Hamburg. Communities, synagogues, and there's a chief rabbi in the city of Altona. Let's go back to Amsterdam. There in Amsterdam, we have a tremendous outbreak of Jewish freedom. For Amsterdam itself is a city where the freedom of thought was very, very important. However, how free as it was, it had its limits. And in Amsterdam, you have, synagogues, first Spanish synagogues, then actually there's an Ashkenazi synagogue that comes later on, at the end of the 17th century. And there are many rabbis. Unfortunately, Amsterdam suffers two major crises. Two Jews, both of them who wrote treatises and books where Judaism was, in a sense, criticized, almost like made a reform Jew, were both excommunicated. One was Uriel da Costa, that came to Adam also from Portugal, and he spoke about a deistic religion, but without commandments, without mitzvot. he was excommunicated. And the other one was the famous philosopher, Benedict or Baruch Spinoza, in the 17th century, also came from Portugal. He is excommunicated because of his view against Judaism. He wrote Spinoza is a very important philosopher. We do not have time to analyze it now, but he's a very important philosopher. The most important book was the 1670. Spinoza was a very important philosopher, and in fact, it inspired many people. Some say that there is a story that Leibniz, some attribute the creation of calculus to him, although some others attribute it to Newton. But the Leibniz met secretly with Spinoza in Amsterdam in the 17th century, and there's a book written about this. The book is essentially a plea for liberty, for freedom. The book is written in the form of mathematical propositions. The book is about the unity of the world, the unity of God. It's almost like a mystical pamphlet. And the famous sentence from him is, Deus sive natura. Whether you find God, you find nature. When you find nature, you find God. God is in nature and everywhere. That's a basic idea of Amsterdam. So we have in therefore a Jewish community in Prague, in Hamburg, in Amsterdam, and in England. I want to talk a little bit about the community in Bohemia, where the great rabbi, Bohemia is the area where today we Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic. The great rabbi there was the most important rabbi, who came from Poland, was Yehuda Leib, the son of Bezalel, the famous Maharal of Prague. Actually, he lives more in the 16th century, but I'm mentioning him because he was the founder of many of the institutions of Prague. The famous donor called Meisel, Jacob Meisel, who eventually creates a Meisel synagogue. All the synagogues of Prague are from the 17th century. One of the most interesting people in this city happens to be the rabbi who succeeded Rabbi the Maharal of Prague. Maharal of Prague, by the way, is the famous one who created that golem, like the Frankenstein-style robot that defended the Jews. Some say that this legend is a fiction, it's not true, but he created. The Maharal of Prague, incidentally, is one of the most prolific and deep philosophers. His thought, his interpretation of Talmud, of philosophy, of ideas, of Jewish literature is legendary. One of the most lucid exponents of Jewish thought, Maharal. But the rabbi who succeeded him was the famous Yom Tov Lippmann Heller. He was born in 1579, dies in 1654. The rabbi of Prague, he is famous he was a rabbi who was interested in mathematics and astronomy, and according to that, he had apparently contact with Kepler, the astronomer. He translated some books, scientific books from the Hebrew to German, and is a famous author of the commentary on the Mishnah called the Tosfos Yom Tov. In his commentary and in his books, he writes about non-Jews, and sometimes he says things which are non-complementary. When the Christian Hebraeus, as we explained, many Christians knew Hebrew and were able to read some of this material, they saw those statements being inimical against the non-Jews, and they wanted to put him in prison. And he defended himself. He says, I wasn't talking about the non-Jews of today, we're talking about the idolaters. But nevertheless, he was dismissed and he was put in jail. He had to pay a very heavy fine to take out of the jail. And he finally moves back to Poland. He ends up being the rabbi of Krakow. It's interesting, by the way, that this is an ancestor of a famous author, Rabbi Heller, the famous author of Tzot HaChoshen. We will discuss this in the next class. I want to speak about other great personalities of this period, and particularly in the German and Polish world. We spoke about the Jews in Holland and England being merchants and great. Of course, there were rabbis, there were students, there were yeshivot, but no community paid more attention to learning and education than the community of Poland. The system was unbelievable. There was a mercantile class, of course, and there were some very rich people, but the rigor with which they emphasized learning Torah. No male left the synagogue after the service without at least spending 1 hour learning. Everybody supported the students of Torah by holding them in their homes, marrying their daughters, supporting them. The community of Poland became a place where Jewish education was paramount, and yeshivot abounded everywhere. So Jews emphasized education, everybody was learning, and in this period of time, despite some explosions of anti-Semitism, there were serious ones, like ritual murderers and others in Lublin, but the Jews were able to thrive in Poland. And let me just give you some of the names of this incredible place. First of all, you have the famous Shalah HaKodesh, Shnei Luchot HaBrit, Isaiah Horowitz, the Polish rabbi who eventually moves to Palestine, is buried in Tiberias. He writes a very important book, philosophy and Kabbalah, called Shnei Luchot HaBrit, the two tablets of the law, usually called as the Shalah HaKodesh. Also, you have in Poland, Mordechai Jaffe, famous author of the book, The Levush. I know that I'm giving you many names, but if you know these names, eventually you will see what happened in the 17th century. Yeshua Falk from Lublin, the author of the major commentary on the Talmud called Pnei Yeshua. Rabbi Meir of Lublin, who was also commentary on the Bible, on the Talmud. Samuel Edels, the famous Maharsha. Edels, by the way, he was supported by his mother-in-law, whose name was Edel. So he wanted his name to be Edels, because he said that all my learning is due to the support of my mother-in-law. Wrote a very important, one of the most important commentaries in the Talmud, published in the Vilna Shas by the Shmuel Edels, Maharsha. All of these people in the 17th century. Yoel Sirkis, also, who wrote a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, Beit Chadash. The initials for Beit Chadash are Bet Chet, so the Jews call them Bach. So this is not the Bach, the musician. This is Bach, the commentator. And so others, the Sifte Cohen, or a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch called the Shah. These are the people who are in Poland. And in an amazing display of learning and scholarship. So just to summarize for a moment. So you have a tremendous interest in Jewish literature, even among the non-Jews, like this Roy Chlin and others. They were interested in Jewish literature. The Jews themselves are enormously involved in all intellectual development, the production of books in the 17th century, as I just explained now for a moment. It's amazing. In addition to philosophy and the concept of Jewish commentaries on the Bible, all of this happened in the 17th century. And then you have these books that promote the concept, the message of Judaism to the world, that there be a redemption. The Jews are now all in every aspect of the world. And as I explained, Menachem ben Israel says that when the Jews are all over, the redemption will come. And in fact, they were all over. I want to talk now, we will discuss, if we have time, a little bit, this history of the Jews of Turkey. But first, I want to address myself to the Jews in America. During the call, the Jews were a very important part of the mercantile class in the world. And the most important center of production, in a sense, of enterprise was in Holland, the famous West Indies Company that did so much to and colonize the America, particularly North America. The Jews of Amsterdam had a very important role in this exchange, in this enterprise. Interesting, by the way, Amsterdam had an exchange, like stock exchange, where people traded coral and sugar and cotton and other imports that they were having. And the Jews were a very important part of the exchange. And also they were a very important part of the Company of Indies, as we will discuss in a moment, why they were so important, you'll see. First of all, the Jews first are in Recife, Brazil. The Portuguese defeat the Dutch. I mean, first the Dutch take over part of Brazil from the Portuguese. A Jewish community exists. The Dutch Jews come to live in Brazil. And then 20 years later, the Portuguese take back the Recife and impose the Inquisition, which causes the Jews to leave Recife, the first community of Jews in America. And where do they go? They go all over the Caribbean, St. Thomas, Curacao, Suriname. All of these places, the Jews are there. And there are graves and gravestones from that time as well. Of course, one of the most important famous is where the Jews come by ship to the city of New Amsterdam, that is New York. The governor, Peter Stuyvesant, refuses to let them in. The Jews appeal to the West Indies Company, India Company, and of course, because they are so influential, the company says to the governor, you must let them in. And the Jews are allowed to remain there, forming the first synagogue in America called Shearith Israel. Another aspect of the Jewish presence in America is also fascinating. Now, you heard of the Pirates of the Caribbean. I don't know if you heard of the Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. Now, why would the Jews be pirates? Well, there are two reasons. First of all, because the Jews are in everything. They excel in whatever they do. Sometimes they even excel in anti-Semitism to a function. So they excel in everything. Whatever there is, Jews are there first. Piracy was a very important tool in America, in the Caribbean particularly, because there were a lot of treasures, a lot of gold that the Spanish were sending away to Europe, bringing to Europe. So what best way of getting money than to take a boat full of gold and confiscate all the money? And that's what the pirates were doing. Now, the Jews were attracted to piracy for a very important reason. They hated the Spaniards. And the British welcomed them. One of the most important colonies in the Caribbean was Jamaica. The British welcomed the Jews to Jamaica. In fact, the Jews come to Jamaica in the year 1655. And Jamaica invited pirates to protect the island. The pirates were like a coast guard against other thieves. They hired the mafia to protect themselves from the other mafia, whatever. And the Jews are also excelled because they were excellent navigators. By the way, the many Spanish and Portuguese Vasco da Gama, for example, credits Jewish teachers for navigation. Same with Vasco da Gama. So many of these Jews, angry with the Spaniards, want to take revenge against them. Let me give you some names. First of all, one was called the Prophet Samuel. That was Rabbi Shmuel Palachi from Morocco, who became a pirate. There was another, Moses Cohen Enriquez. In the year 1628, he captures a Spanish galleon and takes what will be worth today $1 billion worth of gold. He worked with another corsair, Henry Morgan. You know the famous pirate, Henry Morgan. And another famous pirate, Sinan Rees, who sailed under another corsair. So these are the people who are in America. So we have Jews in New York, Jews in the Caribbean, and the 17th century begins to expand in Jewish life. The next part that I want to talk about is, a very sad story. Although Poland had been a great place for the Jews, in the Ukraine area, which used to be part of Poland, the Jews begin to suffer a major catastrophe. This is one of the most decisive events of the 17th century. The famous, when in Hebrew is called the Gezerot Tachpetat, the major persecution of the year 1648 and 1649. What happened was that the Ukrainians were dominated by the Poles. In the year 1648, there was a major rebellion against the Poles. And the patriot who expelled the Polish from Ukraine was a murderer, mass murderer, by the name of Bogdan Khmelnytsky. By the way, Bogdan Khmelnytsky today is hailed as a George Washington of Ukraine. And there's a statue of him in Kiev. Unfortunately, Khmelnytsky hated the Jews and did terrible things to the Jewish people. And the stories about the tragedy that he did were beyond description. They were skinned, flayed. He was really a sadist of the first order. Bogdan Khmelnytsky, Yemach Shemo. These persecutions killed probably at the very least 100,000 Jews and killed almost 300 synagogues in all the area of Ukraine. The Jews now, unfortunately, because of this, begin to move more towards the western direction. So there are more Jews in Germany, more Jews in Holland, more Jews in England, and also they begin to be a migration even to America. So this is what happened or they go eastern, more towards the eastern part of Poland and Russia. So, but these pogroms, this terrible catastrophe was so powerful, so I can only compare it. Imagine what we're having now with the pandemic, and imagine if Chas v'Shalom, the pandemic would affect Jews only. The Jews Chas v'Shalom were dying everywhere. The Jewish people could not recover what is happening. One of the only possible explanations was that this was the time of the Mashiach. The Mashiach is going to come. And during this, so we saw the idea of Mashiach already Ibn Hashem in Israel, who thought that redemption was coming. Now with these terrible persecutions, there were more effervescence for messianic expectations. And unfortunately, this is going to come exactly at the time of a figure that appears in Turkey, in Smyrna, by a young man, charismatic young man, by the name of Shabbatai Tzvi. Shabbatai Tzvi appears in the year 1665, and he declares himself to be the Messiah. Nathan of Gaza, one of his assistants, sends letters to all over the Jewish community saying that there is a Messiah has come, and people really believed it. And the excitement about him was so great that people were dancing when they read the letters. So there's a famous woman in Germany called Gluckel of Hamelin who wrote a memoir, and in her memoir she says, "Our joy when the letters arrive from Smyrna is not to be told. And many sold their houses and lands and all their possessions for the day they hope to be redeemed. My good father-in-law left his home in Hamelin, abandoned his house and all his goodly fortune," and so on. So we see how eager Jews were for the Messiah to come after so many persecutions, and how easily they were swept up by the Messianic program. Many rabbis opposed it. They realized that he was a charlatan. Among them was the two rabbis, major rabbis of Smyrna. One was Rabbi Aaron LaPapa, and the other one was my ancestor, Rabbi Shlomo Algazi, who escaped from Smyrna because opposing Shabtai Tzvi, they were the most unpopular people in Smyrna. Unfortunately, one of the major rabbis at that time was Rab Chaim Ben Benisti, who wrote a very important book called the Knesset HaGdolah, one of the greatest rabbis of Smyrna. And although at the beginning he opposed Shabtai Tzvi, eventually he went over to his side, thinking that perhaps he really was a Messiah. But this only lasted for a little while because the Shabtai Tzvi eventually goes to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and demands recognition as a Messiah of Israel. The Sultan is not convinced. He puts him in jail and says, if you don't convert to Islam, I'm going to kill you. Unfortunately, he does convert to Islam. And of course, many of the people who have followed him stopped following him. But don't think that people did not continue to follow him. Because what we see in the 18th century, many, many Jews are still believing in even though he dies, people still believe in him. In fact, there's a community that a group of Jews, of people who were Jews, called the Donme, who converted to Islam, and they still believe that Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah. In fact, we had one of them as a member of our synagogue here in New York. Of course, converted to Judaism, but they had lived with a belief in Shabtai Tzvi. And the famous rabbis, once again, is Chaim Ben Benisti in Turkey, in Smyrna, Constantinople, Aaron LaPapa, and Rabbi Shlomo Algazi, who was a prolific writer, wrote many, many books. Shlomo Nisim Algazi. Eventually, he goes back to the land of Israel. He runs away, but his children and grandchildren return to Smyrna, where, in fact, my family comes from. So this is the story of the 17th century that I am very happy to present to you. And I hope that you will see in this explosion of genius, from Spinoza to Manshev ben Israel, to the Maharal of Prague, to the Yeshua Horowitz, to all the commentators of the Talmud, all of them in the 17th century, and the Knesset HaGdolah, and Rabbi Shlomo Algazi. These are the great personalities of the 17th century, to whom we actually owe so much of our own literature and learning.